When we look at flow that comes across the left ventricle, across the aorta, and or across the aortic valve and out the aorta, blood flow that's going to perfuse our coronaries is basically going to happen when this aortic valve slams shut. The ostia to the left coronary and the right coronary are right distal to the aortic valve. And so we get our supply to our coronaries during diastole when that valve slams shut.
Hello, my name is Shannon Pecka, and I am a CRNA and the Assistant Program Director at Bryan College of Health Sciences in Lincoln, Nebraska. I teach the advanced pathophysiology courses as well as advanced principles of nurse anesthesia practice courses. And today I am going to talk about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the most common inherited cardiac defect. It is autosomal dominant. It's characterized by left ventricular hypertrophy that occurs in the absence of any other cardiac disease that results in ventricular hypertrophy. So basically, any condition in the left ventricle where the ventricle has to pump and eject blood flow into the systemic circulation that occurs in response to an increase in afterload will result in a compensatory mechanism where the left ventricle will actually hypertrophy, kind of increase its muscle mass in an attempt to basically try to compensate for that increase in afterload or resistance when it's ejecting. So the definition, again, of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is that there's no other disease that causes an increase in resistance. So things like chronic systolic hypertension or aortic stenosis will produce a situation in which the ventricle has to eject more forcefully in order to get blood flow out. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is just that there are no other situations where the ventricular hypertrophy develops from. There are several different forms. We today are going to talk about the most common form, which is characterized by asymmetric hypertrophy of the interventricular septum. That hypertrophy is disproportionate, it's disorganized, and it's located in the upper portion of the septum. And those anatomical changes then go on to cause the obstruction to left ventricular outflow. So the initial event is that the left ventricle starts to remodel. Remember, there's no initiating event that causes an obstruction to outflow. The initial problem is that genetically the left ventricle develops abnormally. So our myocytes, generally, when we look at how our myocytes are laid down in our myocardium, they're very much in parallel and organized in such a fashion that they can all basically work together to help facilitate contraction, but that's laid down in a very organized, systematic manner. In hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, what we see is that those myocytes are laid down haphazardly and not in a nice pattern. And so what results is that the myocytes are abnormal. And there's also abnormal collagen that is laid down in the interstitial space. So between all of our myocytes, there is tissue that holds those myocytes together to create sort of the ventricular mass. And that is the interstitial space between cells in the myocardium. That interstitial space in a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is different because there is abnormal collagen and other proteins that are laid down in the interstitial space. And when that happens, interstitial fibrosis develops. And so what happens is that when that myocardium tries to stretch and relax, it can't do that because it becomes more rigid as these interstitial spaces are filled with fibrosis and it cannot stretch normally, resulting in diastolic dysfunction. The other bullet point was that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is characterized by a disproportionate left ventricular hypertrophy. So that hypertrophy is preferentially deposited in the septum. So this is the left ventricle. and the septum of the left ventricle. In hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, what happens is that the septum, so up over in here, kind of situated upward on the top portion, is the aortic valve. The septum itself, those myocytes that are laid down, preferentially get abnormally laid down on the top part of the septum. And so what you end up with is a septum that is disproportionate and that it's not consistent from top to bottom. And so the problem with that is that this septum then obstructs some of the outflow, ejection to outflow from the left ventricle into the aortic valve, causing an obstruction in the left ventricular outflow tract. That occurs during systole because as the ventricle contracts, it's going to squeeze inward. When it squeezes inward, this places the position of this septum closer over the aortic valve, making and further obstructing outflow out of the left ventricle. So over time, this limitation or this obstruction to outflow is basically going to produce a generalized hypertrophy of the entire left ventricle, because that's going to be an added resistance over time. And over time, the longer the obstruction happens, the more ventricular hypertrophy that you get. So you get a generalized left ventricular hypertrophy in response to that. So the large septum can cause the obstruction. It's important to know that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy can be either obstructive or it can be non-obstructive. So not every diagnosis with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is an individual going to have an obstructive component. And sometimes that obstructive component is dynamic, meaning that depending on different conditions of the myocardium, it can increase the amount of obstruction that it has. One of those events is basically any increases in contractility of the left ventricle. So think about an individual where you have an epinephrine drip produced. That's going to increase contractility. And so if we have this septum that is laid down incorrectly, you have increased contractility that's going to produce increased squeeze of the left ventricle. That contractility is then going to position that septum further over and cause further obstruction. So you can have an individual who doesn't, maybe they don't have a lot of sympathetic activation happening at that time. They might be non-obstructive, but then you create an event where there's increased sympathetic activation, or you give epinephrine, or some event happens where contractility increases, that becomes dynamic, and then your obstruction can develop. It is also dynamic in that it's dependent upon the location of the hypertrophy. It's not always at the top portion of the septum. It is the most common for it to be there, but again, not always. And then it's dependent upon the left ventricular preload. So on the amount of volume and stretch that you can get into the left ventricle during diastole or filling. So you can see that this interventricular septum that's larger produces a problem because it basically takes up space inside our interventricular cavity. And so that is going to create a situation where we're not going to be able to fill the left ventricle as much as we could. Or if you think about situations where you have a lot of blood loss that's happening, or that you have dehydration of an individual that's happening. All of these situations are going to basically decrease the amount of preload that you can actually get into the left ventricle. And when that happens, that positions the interventricular septum closer inward and causes greater obstruction during that time. Obstruction can also be dynamic and be due to systolic anterior motion, or something that is referred to as SAMS. This is basically just a description of restriction to the left ventricular outflow tract that can occur in a dynamic situation. One of the things that happens is that this left ventricle, when it is faced with an obstruction to outflow, what it's going to basically have to do is it's going to basically have to increase its contraction or pressure in order to overcome whatever it must overcome. So if that is pressure in the aortic arch, or if it's that there's an obstruction to the outflow, it's going to increase its pressure as much as it can in order to force blood flow across that aortic valve and out the aortic arch. So that is going to produce pressure differences between the left ventricle and the aortic arch. What that's going to basically produce is that there's a physical principle called the Venturi effect, whereby if you have increased pressure, the pressure in the initiating chamber, which is in this case the left ventricle, has a very slow velocity because it can't move because of that obstruction to outflow. When the differences between the two chambers, for which the initiating chamber and the chamber that it needs to go to, basically produces a situation where blood flow velocity, or how fast blood is flowing across an opening, which in this case is the aortic valve, that when that pressure difference is great, the velocity or flow across that obstruction, or in this case, the left ventricular outflow tract, will increase dramatically in velocity. So the blood flow that's going across the aortic valve is going at a very fast velocity compared to the initiating chamber. And so one of the problems is that the mitral valve is located within the left ventricle. And so as that velocity of flow goes very quickly up across the aortic valve, it pulls and entrains the leaflets of the mitral valve and pulls them closer towards the septum. And so what happens is then that is one of the other additional components that contributes to the left ventricular outflow tract obstruction.
Hey, future CRNA, another daily dose of inspiration along your CRNA journey. This success story starts with these words. With all the happiness in the world, I am so excited to say I was accepted into CRNA school, into my top choice school. My journey has been a roller coaster, to say the least. I'm so blessed for this amazing opportunity. Thank you, CRNA School Prep Academy, for all your amazing resources. Your support resources have helped me during every step of this process. I wish everyone on their journey all the strength and positivity. I say with the utmost certainty that if you want it, you will get there. If you envision it, you will have it. I'm going to be a CRNA, you guys. I can't stop crying. So I wanted to share this because some really inspirational words and motivation from the student is that if you envision it, you will become it. If you believe, you will achieve. And while I know some of you may be full of fear and doubt, this is the transition that needs to occur in your CRNA journey. Really, we're unstoppable as human beings. If we really want something, we will go after it at no avail, right? So I hope that leaves you with this positive reinforcement that you are doing your best. And as long as you keep showing up, you're going to find success. So no matter what experiences you think may hold you back, just embrace it, face it head on. You can do this. I'm rooting for you. Let's get back to the show.
So it's important to recognize things that exacerbate or make SAM worse. That is decreases in afterload. So anything in the systemic side that decreases blood pressure, vasoconstrictors, for example, anything that will reduce or make the pressure in the aortic arch less. So as we have pressure in our aortic arch, if we have large amount of pressure that we need to generate in order to get blood flow out, if we decrease this amount of pressure in here, basically what we're doing is increasing the velocity of flow again across that aortic valve. And so that's going to exacerbate the systolic anterior motion that was just discussed. Increases in contractility for the exact same reason that septum is then pushed closer towards the left ventricular outflow tract and obstructing outflow tract. And then for the same reason, the decreases in preload, which we discussed earlier as well. So any dynamic conditions will exacerbate the issue of the obstruction. Diastolic dysfunction is also universal in all types of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. As I discussed earlier, when the myocytes are laying down genetically, there's that interstitial fibrosis that is laid down within the myocardium itself. And so what that means is when filling happens from the left atria into the left ventricle, it makes stretching of the ventricles much more difficult. And so diastolic dysfunction develops as the ventricle is not able to stretch to accommodate the blood flow that comes in. So the left ventricle becomes stiff, its compliance goes down, and therefore ventricular preload is reduced and ability to fill, it becomes reduced. Systolic function, when we look at ejection fraction, it is normal or maybe actually being slightly increased. If we look at the formula for what ejection fraction is, ejection fraction equals left ventricular end diastolic volume minus left ventricular end systolic volume divided by left ventricular end diastolic volume. And so this is basically just a percentage. So if we look at what that means, it means that as the left ventricle stretches, it's going to accommodate a certain amount of volume until it gets full. When the ventricle contracts, it is going to contract and eject a certain amount of blood flow that is going to then leave the ventricle, be ejected across the aortic valve, and then the valve is going to basically slam shut over here. And we're going to get that certain amount of stroke volume or cardiac output that's going to be ejected. The amount ejected does not equal ejection fraction. So it's important to recognize that ejection fraction does not equal stroke volume, does not equal cardiac output. And the reason for that is because ejection fraction, again, this is the amount that we started with. This is the amount that was ejected. That means that this is the amount that is remaining in the ventricle at the end of contraction. That means that this is the amount that was actually ejected. So it's basically the amount that you started with minus the amount that you ended with, and a percentage of that is actually your ejection fraction. So in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, when we think about the left ventricle, and we said that its intraventricular chamber was actually smaller because we've got all these anatomical changes, that means that the amount that we started with is much less. If we don't have a lot of obstruction that happens, that means that the amount that we can actually eject is actually quite large. And so the ejection fraction may actually be quite high because the percentage that actually leaves might actually be quite high. So ejection fraction could actually be normal, or it could be slightly high in individuals with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy because they does not equal cardiac output or stroke volume. So the other consideration is the effect on coronary perfusion. So left ventricle and the aorta. So when we think about supply, and we just talked about the fact that the amount of cardiac output that's actually going across the aortic valve may actually be decreased, that means that our diastolic blood pressure out here is likely to be decreased. When we look at flow that comes across the left ventricle, across the aorta, or across the aortic valve and out the aorta, blood flow that's going to perfuse our coronaries is basically going to happen when this aortic valve slams shut. The ostia to the left coronary and the right coronary are right distal to the aortic valve. And so we get our supply to our coronaries during diastole when that valve slams shut. So basically the pressure from diastole is then going to be the driving pressure for our coronaries. So if we think about the impact of obstruction and the fact that we don't have as much cardiac output, stroke volume, and therefore decreased blood pressure, for supply, that means that we have decreased supply because we have decreased beginning pressure. And if we look at the formula for coronary perfusion pressure, or the amount of coronary perfusion that our coronaries get, it is diastolic blood pressure minus left ventricular end diastolic pressure. So when you start with a decreased amount of diastolic pressure, you're going to end up with decreases in coronary perfusion pressure. So from the start, our supply of coronary flow is reduced. It also impacts demand. and that we've talked about, that resistance to outflow is going to basically cause increases in muscle mass of that ventricle. The coronary vessels basically are on the epicardial surface. They then basically dive down and then be able to provide perfusion for the subendocardial portions of the ventricle itself. And so if we have a greater mass that we have to account for, that means that we have a greater oxygen demand that we need to account for. And so we, in addition to decreases in supply, what we end up with is increases in demand. And so ultimately, the balance between supply and demand is sacrificed. And so individuals are at risk for myocardial ischemia. So imbalances in myocardial oxygen and supply and demand occur in all people, regardless of the presence of coronary artery disease. Again, because of that increase in muscle mass. It is also because we have an increase in our systolic wall tension. So if this left ventricle has to accommodate this obstruction to outflow, it's going to increase the pressure during systole in order to accommodate that and contract against that obstruction. So that is going to produce increases in demand for our oxygen. And then, as we discussed earlier, decreases in cardiac output, which are going to result in decreases in diastolic blood pressure. So if we think about manifestations, they're very consistent with what we see in the pathophysiology. We see cardiomegaly because we see changes in that left ventricle. Those changes are all left-sided changes. Our right-sided structures are generally normal because it doesn't generally affect our right side. We will see left ventricular hypertrophy for all the reasons we talked about. And we will also see an enlarged dilated left atria because as pressure in the left ventricle increases, what happens is that pressure is then transmitted to the left atria, causing dilation over time when that mitral valve is open at certain points of the cardiac cycle. In terms of the EKG, we also see left ventricular hypertrophy, left atrial enlargement, causing a high QRS voltage. In our echocardiogram, we will also see that left ventricular hypertrophy. We will see that asymmetrical wall thickness because our septum, again, is improperly constructed. We will see that a septal hypertrophy. When looking at the echocardiogram, one should assess what's going on with the mitral valve leaflet. So you would want to look at the mitral valve to see what the echo is saying is happening with that mitral valve. Is it causing further obstruction or is it okay as it is? And then again, reviewing the ejection fraction and then interpreting that with the knowledge that ejection fraction does not equal cardiac output in ejection. It just means the amount that we started with minus the amount that we ended with, and then a percentage of how much actually was ejected. So for anesthesia, our treatment goals are basically aimed at contractility. We want to make sure that we don't create situations that increase contractility. So increases in sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Epinephrine is not always a good solution. Labetalol may be a good solution because it is not going to increase that contractility. So what you want to do is aim for situations where you're not increasing contractility, but still maintaining cardiac output and forward flow. You want to try to make sure to maintain preload. So we think about estimated blood loss in the operating room, volume, fluids. What we want to do is optimize our ventricular filling to try to stretch that out, try to get that interventricular chamber stretched out as much as possible, and try to open up this left ventricular outflow tract to optimize the amount of blood flow that can get across. Our afterload we want to look at because, again, decreases in afterload, decreases in blood pressure cause those big dramatic changes between the chambers, which then increases the velocity of flow across the aortic valve, which then again pulls that mitral valve leaflet over that direction. So we want to kind of sometimes at some points tighten people up just optimally enough to get diastolic pressure so that our coronaries can get flow, and optimize supply and demand for our coronaries. We now have just a very short video of our program. And thank you for listening to the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy. I invite you to listen to a short video for the College of Nurse Anesthesia.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sharon Haydenfeld, a CRNA and the Program Director at Bryan College of Health Sciences, School of Nurse Anesthesia. We'd like to introduce you to our program and tell you about a few of our highlights. There are many exciting opportunities in the CRNA career, and you are choosing a great time to further your education. Please let me introduce you to our Graduate Student Coordinator, Lauren Erickson.
Thank you, Dr. Haydenfeld. As she mentioned, my name is Lauren Erickson, and I am here to help you every step of the way. Whether you're learning about our program or applying, I'm going to be your main point of contact. I'm going to share my screen and tell you a bit about our program and what makes us special. As we mentioned, our program is a Doctor of Nurse Anesthesia Practice program, and our program is 3 years in length. We begin once a year in May, and over the course of the 3-year program, you'll complete 86 semester credit hours. Students are full-time. You can typically expect 50 to 60 hours a week of attending class, studying, and completing clinical. And one of the items that makes our program very unique is we are primarily face-to-face. Our campus is located in Lincoln, Nebraska, and the vast majority of courses are held in person here in Lincoln. We have a few select courses that are offered in a hybrid format, but for the vast majority of your learning, you'll be here in person. Our program is divided into 2 unique phases. Phase 1 involves 12 months of classroom study and clinical practice. Phase 1 of the program feels very much like you are in school full-time. You're typically on campus at least 3 days a week, and you're studying a lot. Phase 2 is the final 24 months of the program, and this is where students engage in active clinical practice and are mentored in clinical leadership. During Phase 2, it's going to feel like you're working full-time and going to school part-time. You're typically in a clinical setting 4 to 5 days a week, but you are still taking classes, and you're going to be on campus a few times a month, and you'll be reconnecting with your fellow students, participating in simulation, but that portion of the program definitely feels more like you're in school part-time, but working full-time. We are very proud of our clinical experience while you're in the program. You're assigned a clinical home site, and that clinical home site is where the vast majority of your clinical experience is done. Usually 50 to 75% of your clinical experience is done at the home site. We have options in Lincoln, Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, Hastings, Nebraska, and Kearney, Nebraska. In addition to those home sites, we have a variety of relationships with hospitals throughout Nebraska and even a few in Iowa, and you will go on these rural rotations to gain additional experience, work with independent CRNAs, and really broaden your scope. If you like that rural setting, we always have additional opportunities available if you'd like to experience different clinical sites. Now, we all know you guys are probably looking around at different programs, trying to figure out which is the best fit for you. So I want to highlight a few of the items that make our program unique. First and foremost are our faculty. We feature 5 CRNA faculty members. They hold advanced degrees and have a wealth of knowledge in both the classroom and in clinical settings. Our CRNA faculty teach all but 3 courses within the program. They're known for their close collaboration and investment in students and their open door policy. During your very first semester, we feature a human anatomy lab where you're working with cadavers. And last but not least, we're going to return to that clinical piece. You are going to get a vast array of clinical experiences by coming to Bryan College. The minimum number of clinical hours you need is 2,000. However, our May 2023 graduates, they averaged over 3,000 clinical hours. So that means when they graduate, they're ready to get into their profession and they have the confidence to work a variety of cases. From here, we'd love to hear from you. Our application cycle is open from April 1st through August 31st. So if you're thinking of applying, now is a great time to get into contact with us. You can see my email address and phone number here. Like I said at the beginning, I'll be your main point of contact from start to finish. So if you have questions, if you want to chat, or you're ready to apply, please let us know. Thank you for considering Bryan College of Health Sciences, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Hey, future CRNA, as always, I appreciate you and your loyalty. Thank you so very much for tuning in this week. I'd love to hear from you, so screenshot this episode and share it to your IG stories with your biggest takeaway. Don't forget to tag me at CRNA School Prep Academy so I can personally thank you. Be sure to head over to CRNASchoolPrepAcademy.com to check out our blog and gather free resources to help you along your CRNA journey. Stay strong, and I'll see you next week.